Another report from the UN's top climate change body, and the picture isn't improving. Question is, why? With such dire predictions for our environmental future, shouldn't these reports be sinking in? Or is the work of more than 1,000 people being wasted, or perhaps worse, denied? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Kamahl Santamaria. Climate change is an easy topic for us to discuss because it's always there, and so are the facts. In fact, there are more facts right now, more conclusive evidence than ever that we humans are the ones causing climate change. But what we want to do in Inside Story today is discuss why it's not making a difference. Why has scientific understanding not led to a change in the way we think? For example, here is what the world's leading body for assessing the damage done by climate change released on Sunday. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's third report in a series of them, saying that global greenhouse gas emissions over the past decade were the highest in human history, and that without action, temperatures could increase by 4 to 5 degrees Celsius, which would have devastating effects on the planet. But the report reckons it's not too late or too expensive to limit the damage if we can keep the rise in temperature to 2 degrees or less. That would mean slashing emissions by between 40 and 70% by the year 2050, as well as tripling our use of clean energy. So again, with that sort of evidence, why the lack of change? We've got a few theories to talk about. One would be the interest of big businesses and lobby groups who have the money to deny climate change with great effect because it suits their own interests. Another would be a lack of political will, politicians and governments who talk big but again won't commit to something that could financially impact them more than other countries. Kyoto Protocol, a classic example of that. But could it also be down to the scientists themselves to better communicate their findings to the public, rely less on the numbers and the reports and more on practical scenarios that everyone can understand? Lots of things for us to discuss, and we will do that with our own Inside Story panel on climate change. We start in Berlin with Karen Seto, who is actually one of the co-authors, the coordinating lead author of the IPCC report on climate change and global warming. Karen specialises in urbanisation and environmental change. And over in London, we've got Bob Ward, Policy and Communications Director of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. That is at the London School of Economics. Karen, Bob, we thank you both for your time. As I said in the intro there, I really do want the discussion to go beyond the details of the report and look at why things aren't changing. But Karen, we'll start with you, seeing as we've got you with us and you are the author of the report. Let's go through some of the things. I see this number 2 degrees, keeping the temperatures to a maximum rise of 2 degrees. Is that like a magic number for us here? If we can keep it there, then that's well inside the safe zone or just bearable on the cusp? Tell me how it works.
Well, what we want to do is explore the range of mitigation options and strategies that are out there to keep temperature at a safe range for humankind. It's really that simple. I think in many ways it boils down to beyond just the numbers of whether it's 2 degrees or 3 degrees, really. I mean, when you think about your own home and the temperature fluctuations in your home, well, whether you keep your thermostat at 55 or 56 degrees, well, probably doesn't make that much of a difference for you. But there are a lot of other species on this planet for which that 1 degree would make a very big difference. I'm talking about plants and other animals that for which a 1 degree difference would make a big impact. But here I think the real issue is what are the range of options that are really available to us across different levels of government, across different individuals for different countries, that would allow us to keep the emissions at a relatively low level.
Okay, and that was the next point.
Actually, to prevent them from
Well, that was the next point I was going to
increase.
make. This number of 40 or between 40 and 70% cut in emissions in, well, I think it would be about 36 years by the year 2050. Again, that sounds to me, layperson, like a pretty big range, a pretty hefty goal. How difficult would that be, do you think, to reach those sorts of cuts?
I have to say, I'm pretty optimistic about the kinds of cuts that can be made in the coming decades. And I think when we look in the next 20 to 30 years, one of the biggest trends that's happening right now is urbanization. Urbanization in the Middle East, in Asia, and in Africa. We're going to see somewhere between 2 to about 4 billion more people on the planet who live in urban areas. And that means that we're going to be building a lot of cities, a lot of roads, a lot of buildings. And what this also means is that the majority of the cities of tomorrow have yet to be built. And so this presents an enormous opportunity, and really it gives me quite a lot of hope for ways in which we can change the course of emissions. And at the same time, it's very clear from the report that there are a lot of strategies that can be much more effective than what is being implemented today. I mean, what we're seeing from the report is that despite a lot of mitigation efforts by countries, by the private sector, by cities, that emissions are continuing to rise and at an increasing rate. And part of why we're seeing that is because the strategies that have been employed are not the most effective strategies.
Right.
And so we need to change the way in which we are addressing how we can reduce emissions.
Right, and that's something we're going to get onto later in the program. I've got one more quick question for you, Karen, before I bring Bob in, and that is just about the report itself. I've read that there were 1,250 people involved in just producing this report. Can you give me a quick précis of what those people are doing, what sort of work they have to do, what sort of jobs, how the work is divided, and how long it takes to get this report put together?
Well, that's a good question. This report, I will say, is quite a collaborative effort that involves clearly hundreds of people, more than 1,000 people from many different disciplines, many countries, many different perspectives. And like any effort that involves so many different scientists and researchers from so many different perspectives, it takes quite a bit of time to hash out, come to agreement on what it is that we're assessing, look at the range of literatures. In terms of thinking about the division of labor, what we, at least in our chapter, the chapter on human settlements, infrastructure, and spatial planning, we had experts from Africa, from Asia, from South America. And so each of the authors assesses literature in his or her native language, assesses literature that's published in a variety of different formats. We look at peer-reviewed literature, we look at literature from the government that's been published by government sources, also from private industry. And at the same time, the process involves multiple levels of interaction with government and other peer reviewers. So we went through 3 different sets of peer reviews to make sure that the literature that we were assessing was accurate, and that basically that there's a high level of accuracy throughout the entire report.
Bob Ward over in London, how are you? Let's bring you into the conversation now, listening to what
there.
Karen's been saying. My concern, and really the concern that we're looking at with this program, is that everything Karen's just described for us, all that work, all those man-hours which go into putting together these reports, get somewhat wasted, because reports come out every year. The IPCC has put out 5 major assessment reports since 2006, I think it was, and really the situation hasn't changed. The thinking of people hasn't changed. Is that a concern that things aren't changing enough?
Well, I think it would be wrong to claim that nothing's happening, and perhaps I could start by coming back to that 2-degree target, because it is an important point, is that all of the world's governments agreed in Mexico in 2010 that annual emissions of greenhouse gases should be cut sharply to avoid global warming of more than 2 degrees. And the reason governments have agreed to that were actually spelled out very clearly in the last report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was published a couple of weeks ago, which looked at the potential impacts. And it pointed to a whole range of risks that increase very much beyond that 2-degree target, particularly very large-scale ones that could cause disruption around the world. So, for instance, if you look at the ice sheet on Greenland, the report pointed out that between 1 and 4 degrees of warming, we could see an irreversible start of an irreversible process of warming. And Greenland's ice sheet contains enough water to raise global sea levels by 6 meters or more, and you can imagine how much disruption that would cause.
The key thing you've said there is that governments have signed on and governments agreed to this. Do we have a clash there when you've got, and this is the argument that's often thrown up about the interests of big businesses and lobby groups who are the ones who actually end up controlling what really happens?
The governments have agreed as a result of that to set a series of targets for reducing their emissions by 2020, which are not sufficient to get us towards that 2-degree target, but it's the start of that process. The role of governments is to set good, clear policy that makes clear to businesses where what the direction is, to make clear that we are heading towards a world in which we will have to cut emissions very sharply, that we will have to reduce our dependence on older, dirtier technologies and aim for more clean and efficient. And one of the ways in which governments can do that is by putting a price on carbon. That was a key point that's highlighted in this report. Now, you are seeing some countries around the world have already introduced it. The European Union has had a process for putting a price on carbon since 2005. It's not worked perfectly, but it's getting better. We see several provinces in China now introducing carbon trading, which will allow a price on carbon. California's introduced it. So these are happening, but they're not happening quickly enough. And the report makes a clear case for an acceleration. You're quite right that one of the things government has to do is manage the various vested interests, and there are vested interests on all sides. But the point is this, that we have a clear choice here between running huge risks that will undermine people's quality of life around the world if we carry on with our continuing path. The path of cleaner, more efficient growth is not that is cleaner, but it's also not that much more expensive than we're currently paying. And in fact, when you look at the potential cost we would pay if we carry on towards a case of unmanaged climate change, we would end up dealing with a far bigger cost in the long run. It's much more cost effective for us to move off our path and move towards a cleaner way of growing and developing. Right,
and we're going to talk more about those ways a little bit later. Quick question for both of you, and Bob, I might start with you and then I'll come to you, Karen. One of the things I don't get, I guess, is the success of climate deniers. The reports that we're talking about is putting out this evidence which is becoming really incontrovertible, and yet, Bob, let's start with you. The climate deniers, if you like, and I think the business groups and all that are included in this, still seem to be very successful. Can you suggest why?
Climate deniers, as you described them, or climate change skeptics, are really only a major factor in a minor number of countries, Australia, United States, United Kingdom, where you have an alliance of fossil fuel industry, private interests, and right-wing conservative groups who are opposed in principle to any regulation of business. And part of the reason they've been so successful has been the way in which they've thrown money at lobbying politicians, but also at persuading the media to provide them with far more airtime than they deserve. But in the end, it's a clear choice between their narrow interests and the wider interests of populations. The majority of businesses would benefit from cleaner growth. The fossil fuel industries in most of those countries that I described actually constitute a very small part of the economy, and it needs to be managed, this transition away from dirtier growth. In fact, fossil fuels could have a future if we introduce carbon capture and storage technology, which would allow you to burn fossil fuels for energy, but you don't release the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
I'm glad you brought that up, because we've actually got a little segment on that in the moment. I want a quick word from Karen just before we move on. Bob made the good point there and said, you know, these climate change deniers are only in a small number of places, but he listed Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States. These are big influential countries on the global scene.
Yeah, Bob is absolutely right on this. I mean, we're talking about a very, very small percentage of the population worldwide who are getting a disproportionate amount of airtime. The fact that we're even talking about this now is just another example of their disproportionate amount of airtime. But I want to bring up another point about the climate skeptics, that in fact, if you talk to people who are climate skeptics, often if you phrase the question slightly differently, not about climate change, but about changes that they have seen in their own lifetime. So for example, shorter winters, less snowfall. I mean, this year in California, the ski resorts in the Tahoe region had a very short ski season. And this is a concern not only for the Tahoe or California, but actually a lot of winter sports. In fact, there was a big issue at the Sochi Olympics, right?
That's right.
And I know that a number of Olympians have talked about their concern around how climate change will impact winter sports altogether. So I think that if we change the dialogue a little bit, not just about climate change, but about other very evident impacts of climate change that are being felt around the world, it's very clear that that climate change is happening, and that it's difficult to deny that these impacts are being felt today, and that this is about impacts and effects today, not effects 50 years from now or 100 years from now.
All right, Karen, Bob, stay there for 1 second because I want to pick up on one of these technologies that scientists have been recommending, and Bob mentioned it himself before I cut him off on it. This is known as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. The idea is that, say, a power plant would burn things like agricultural waste or wood to produce energy. The emissions from the process are then captured and stored underground. Now, the major benefit to that is that, unlike fossil fuels, this technique relies on renewable biomass, so that's a good thing. But critics say it could drive deforestation and doesn't stop the actual problem of producing emissions. Karen, the report seemed to say, I think I'm quoting correctly here, that, and it was speaking directly of this technology, that it has not yet been applied at a large commercial scale. So what's the problem there? Is it money? Is it will? Is it lack of development? Why can't something like this become more mainstream? Will it become more mainstream?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the report highlights a number of different climate mitigation strategies, of which this is just one. And in fact, you're absolutely right that this has not been implemented at a large scale, and the impacts are very unknown. You've mentioned some of the possible impacts that have raised concerns, such as leakage or basically having a negative impact in other sectors. But this is really one of many different strategies. And here, I want to highlight that the report does discuss and assesses other mitigation strategies that are not just around transitions of the energy system. If we look at the transport, the buildings, industry, cities, across a number of different sectors, it's very clear that there are a number of different changes that could be, or different strategies around changing demand. And so these are mitigation strategies and options that are really focused more around changing demand, changing lifestyles, and changing behavior.
Okay, Bob, let me bring you back in. One more topic I want to discuss, which I did mention at the top of the program, and I guess this is the idea of the message, communicating the message. Do you think that the scientists, those people who are at the coalface, pardon my phrase, the coalface of all of this, are the ones who need to get the message out there more? Not wait for reports to come out like this, actually get out there in people's faces. You know, think about cigarette packs now, which have that very graphic pictures on them showing the effects of cigarettes and something like that. Maybe climate change needs to go down that path, buying up advertising time, making it a mainstream issue and not just waiting for these reports to come out.
Well, I think the scientists, and it's not just scientists, but it's a whole range of disciplines, people who are involved in studying the evidence, including economists, social scientists, engineers. They do need to do a better job of communicating, but it's not really only their responsibility. This is really about choices we make together as populations. And I would like to see much more of a public debate where politicians and the public play their reasonable role. In the end, these scientists and economists and engineers lay out the options. And what they're saying very clearly is if we carry on with our business as usual path, we're going to face enormous risks that could threaten the lives and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people around the world. And any sensible approach to risk management would want to avoid those. But how we do this then, and the choices we make about changing our type of economic growth and development. They are choices, and we have to make them deliberate. People who argue that the risks don't exist are just distracting and trying to stop us from grasping these problems. And they are fairly weighty, and they require something very radical. But, you know, we've seen throughout human history radical changes in the way we live. If you think about the introduction of electricity, if you just think about the introduction of trains, these are massive changes that happened, and we could see the benefits. The low carbon transition, where we move away from these dirty ways that we're currently reliant on, is actually something that's very attractive. It will deliver not just an avoidance of those climate risks, but it will also deliver other benefits. You know, if you close down a lot more of the coal-fired power stations around cities, as we've seen in China, you'll improve local air quality, which will have multiple other benefits. And that's why this path towards a cleaner economic development and growth is attractive on so many fronts. It's hard to imagine any serious argument against it.
Karen, what do you think what do you see your job as? Bob was saying that it's the job of the scientists and the economists to lay out the argument, and then it needs to be publicly debated and really thrashed out like that. Do you see that as your job, or do you think maybe those putting together these reports, those doing the research, need to get more, you know, militant about it and really get out there and make sure that people understand how serious this is?
Well, I think that we all have a responsibility as scientists to share the message, share the findings. I think that the IPCC reports are one way to get these messages out, and it's the official way to have a dialogue between the science and the policymakers, right? These IPCC reports, and especially the summary for policymakers, really is the bridge between science and policy making. But at the same time, we know that there are a number of different ways in which we can inform the public, and that the public includes not only the policymakers, but also the private sector, NGOs, the ordinary citizen at home who's watching the show. And I think that it is certainly our responsibility to make it very clear what the risks are and what the potential impacts are if we continue business as usual. I think it's very clear. This report lays out in a very clear way, more than any other of the previous reports, that if we continue on business as usual, this is not a sustainable path, and that the consequences are really dire. And I think that one of the exciting things, and going back to this issue of optimism, is that there are many different pathways or many different mitigation strategies and options that are out there. Some of these strategies are best implemented at the national level. Some of these may be best implemented at the local or urban or regional level. But some of these also involve changes in lifestyles, modifications in our behavior that will actually, on aggregate, have a very big impact. And I think that's pretty important. And here I want to just follow up on something that Bob said about some of the benefits. And I think this is a really important message that we need to get out, which is that many of the mitigation strategies that are out there at the individual level or at the national level make sense for business. They make sense for our pocketbooks.
I just want to get a quick word to Bob before we just ran out of time. There will undoubtedly, this was the third, Bob, in a series of reports. There will undoubtedly be another one to come in however many months' time. Do you think these things can start to make a difference, an impact, a real impact, and not just be numbers that come out? Just quickly.
Yeah, I think these are going to make a big impact. Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, is gathering world leaders together in New York in September to get them to really commit now to a process which is leading towards a major new international agreement on climate change in Paris in December 2015. So I think this is going to provide the essential evidence. It is political will that makes all the difference now. There's no longer any justification for saying the analysis is not there. The IPCC has laid it out very clearly. It's now about getting politicians to show leadership. That's what we need.
Karen Seto and Bob Ward joining us for this climate change discussion on The Inside Story. We thank you very much for your time. And just a final word to one of our viewers, actually. When we asked the question earlier today, why is the message not getting through? They simply replied, because of oil. You can add your voice to this discussion as well. Your comments are welcome as always. You can leave your thoughts on Facebook and Twitter for us. The addresses are at the bottom of the screen right now. I'm Kamahl Santamaria on behalf of the whole team. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.